He was not a traitor, not a heretic, not a fool, just a man who stood beside the wrong prince. That's all it took. Not a sword raised in rebellion, not a letter of conspiracy. Just one moment, one name spoken out loud in the wrong cathedral. And from that moment, fire was the only answer the crown would give him. They said he didn't scream, not until the flesh began to slide from the bone. Words passed in hushed taverns and smoke-lit monasteries, whispered like curse or prayer. But the truth of his death wasn't in the heat. It was in the silence of the church, in the way they turned their eyes when the boiling pitch was poured. That silence was older than kingdoms and far more loyal. He chose faith over safety, principle over obedience. And for that he was sentenced to melt, not hang, not rot, but melt, alive in black tar. And though his name would be erased from the records, his scream would echo longer than any sermon. This isn't a story of rebellion. It's a story of how belief becomes threat when uttered at the wrong time. How loyalty, when pointed at the wrong heir, becomes treason. And how one bishop's vow to truth, not to power, was answered by a crown afraid of ghosts in robes. The church never spoke his name again, but the fire did. In every torchlit corridor, in every sermon turned silent, in every oath sworn with one eye on the throne. And it all began with a promise, one whispered vow in the wrong century. Now let's go back to where it should have ended differently. He should have never been born into that bloodline, not because it was cursed, but because it was confused, torn between Norman ambition and Saxon memory. Hugh wasn't built for war, but war had built the world around him. He grew up with silence in the chapel and screams beyond the walls. And even as a child, he learned that praying louder didn't drown out the sound of dying. His father served one king. His uncles pledged to another. And the ground beneath their manor changed owners more often than the church changed robes. By the time he was 12, the only thing left of his family was their name, and even that was safer buried. The abbey took him in not out of mercy, but because no one else would. They shaved his head, handed him scripture, and told him silence would protect him. They were wrong. The abbots thought he would disappear into obedience. Instead, he devoured every text they locked away. Roman law, Greek ethics, early Christian heresies. His hands trembled over pages not from reverence, but because they gave shape to what he already knew deep inside. The world was ruled not by truth, but by who dared to speak it aloud. He wasn't pious, he was precise, not righteous, relentless. And beneath the robes, something sharper than faith began to grow. He didn't seek influence, it found him. First in whispered admiration from younger monks, then in requests from nobles to bless their land. Finally, in invitations to court, not because of his name, but because of the way his voice held stillness like a sword. When power began to notice him, he had already stopped fearing it. That made him dangerous. And then came the fracture, the king's death and 2 sons clutching for the same throne. The church held its breath, pretending neutrality, but Hugh didn't. He stood beside the elder Robert, not because he loved him, but because Robert, unlike his brother William, had promised something sacred, land back to the church and silence back to the people. Hugh didn't believe him, but he believed in holding men to their promises. He spoke that name, Robert, in a mass heard by lords and spies alike. That was the moment the rope tightened. He didn't pick a side, he picked a vow. But in a time where vows were currency, that made him look like a buyer the crown couldn't afford. And still, he didn't step back. When other clerics folded, he doubled down. When the throne sent warnings, he responded with scripture. And when a fellow bishop told him, "The king remembers everything," Hugh only said, "So does God." That's when the silence around him began to change, not peaceful, not holy, just final. And the next step he took would make turning back impossible. He stepped forward when silence would have saved him. The court was quiet the day he entered, not because they feared him, but because they feared what his presence said, that the church would not bend. Not this time, not this bishop. Hugh didn't arrive with soldiers. He arrived with scripture in hand, and a name already condemned on his tongue. He blessed Robert's standard before the war even began, not on a battlefield, but in a cathedral, where words could cut deeper than blades. When he raised his hand and invoked the authority of heaven upon the elder son, everyone knew. This wasn't politics anymore. It was divine endorsement. It was provocation dressed in liturgy. He was the first bishop to stand against the king's younger son and the last to stand that long. The others watched from shadows. They waited, calculated. Some even prayed for both brothers, hedging faith like coin. But Hugh made a choice that couldn't be unsaid, and once spoken, it made every step after heavier with consequence. The royal court moved quickly, subtle at first. Land grants revoked, messengers delayed, tax collectors showing up in parishes loyal to him. The king hadn't spoken his name, but the heat was rising around him. By the time Hugh realized how deep the net went, even his letters stopped reaching Rome. He was already being unmade, but Hugh didn't flinch. He wrote sermons sharper than threats. He quoted scripture at nobles who demanded his silence. He refused bribes masked as donations, and he refused to apologize when asked privately to reconsider his wording. Because for Hugh, words weren't accidents, they were weapons, and he'd already fired the first shot. He was warned, not once, not subtly. A servant found a black feather on his altar. A crypt door, always sealed, swung open during midnight mass. One of his deacons vanished on the road, reappearing days later with his tongue cut out. That's how they whispered to him now, through silence and fear. But he kept preaching. Not louder, not more defiantly, just steadily, like someone walking toward fire, eyes open, hands unclenched. It wasn't defiance. It was duty carried to its final form. And when the king finally summoned him, Hugh didn't kneel. He stood, before lords, before swords, before the crown itself. And when asked if he regretted his allegiance, he answered with only 5 words: "The truth is not yours." That sentence sealed his fate. But it didn't end the war, it started another kind. One not fought with armies, but with fear, with silence, with fire. And now the world around him began to crack, not with war drums, but with whispers. ChatGPT said, the silence turned sharp. Not the sacred kind, the kind that creaks before a door is broken down. the kind that seeps into the walls of churches, into the eyes of men who once called you brother and now don't meet your gaze. Hugh could feel it, the shift, the hesitation in every handshake, the pauses before prayers. Loyalty had become a liability, and in this new order, even holiness had to choose a side. The church didn't defend him, it distanced itself. Letters from Canterbury stopped arriving. A planned pilgrimage was quietly canceled. Bishops who once shared wine with him now quoted doctrine instead of friendship. Rome remained silent, and in that silence, something worse began to move. Doubt not in Hugh, but in everyone around him. The lords began to fracture, some quietly seeking penance, others sharpening blades. Those loyal to Robert found themselves taxed into starvation. Villages that spoke his name saw their abbeys looted under the guise of reallocation. William's rule wasn't just law, it was strategy, cold and precise. Break the infrastructure, and the soul follows. In Hugh's own diocese, whispers turned to warnings. One priest resigned mid-sermon. Another was found praying in Latin wrong on purpose, hoping they'd think he was mad. A monk who dared defend Hugh publicly was found in a river with his robes filled with stones. Everyone understood now, this wasn't about who you supported. It was about who remembered you supported them. And still, Hugh stood. But even stone cracks when the earth shifts beneath it. The villagers who once kissed his hand now avoided his steps. The donations stopped. The pilgrims turned elsewhere. He was not just isolated, he was radioactive. Holiness, when untethered from power, became a dangerous kind of contagion. Inside his own cathedral, someone painted over the mural of St. Stephen with soot. A message, the first martyr, burned alive. They were not subtle anymore. Even his family distanced themselves. A distant cousin aligned with the new court sent him a letter. For the sake of your legacy, withdraw. Hugh burned it without replying. But the message was already echoing in his halls. And then came the final crack, the loss that made everything real. His protege, a young scholar named Elric, disappeared. No ransom, no burial, just a single page from Hugh's own sermon left at the cathedral gates with blood instead of ink. That was the moment the veil dropped. This wasn't political anymore. This was sacred war. And what followed was no longer judgment, it was punishment. There were no more warnings, only wolves. They didn't come with banners or decrees. They came with torches and quiet footsteps. First, it was the monastery's grain stores, burned in the night. Then the cloister's library set ablaze during Vespers. No culprits, no trials, just fire and the heavy silence that always followed. Law had left the land. What remained was hunger, fear, and the crown's shadow. The king didn't need to send armies. He let chaos do the work. Hugh's diocese, once orderly and austere, now turned on itself. Hungry peasants raided bakeries blessed only hours earlier. Monks hid their robes to escape recognition. One priest slit a thief's throat with a broken crucifix. When power unravels, even the faithful forget how to pray. The king's men arrived not to arrest, but to observe. Dressed in dark cloth, speaking little, recording names. They stood at the back of ruined churches, counting who stayed behind. And each morning after they left, another holy man was missing. The purge was surgical, and it wore the face of order. Then they came for Hugh's relics. The crown declared them property of the state, stripping altars bare. A statue of St. Peter was broken at the ankles and dragged into the street. The chalice Hugh used for mass was melted down for coin. They took the bell from the steeple because even sound had become dangerous. By now, no one spoke Hugh's name aloud, not out of fear, out of survival. He was no longer a man. He was a sentence, a symbol, a mark you scraped off stone when no one was looking. To defend him was to invite ruin. To remember him was to risk being remembered with him. And Hugh, he remained, but not untouched. He stopped speaking during meals. He refused to preach to empty pews. He spent hours alone in the crypt, beneath the altar, praying beside bones no one else dared visit. They say his eyes lost color, that his voice grew hoarse not from shouting but from silence. Then came the soldiers, not many, not loud, just enough to make it clear this was the end. No charge was read, no trial was offered. One night, a boy no older than Hugh had been when he first entered the abbey simply said, "You've been summoned by the king." And Hugh answered with the only word that still belonged to him, "When?" That was the last day the cathedral doors were ever locked, because after that, there was nothing left to steal. They didn't chain him, they didn't gag him, they didn't need to. By the time they led Bishop Hugh through the streets, the city had already decided he was guilty, not of treason, not of heresy, but of something far worse in a kingdom built on fear, refusing to be silent. He walked past his own cathedral as if it were already his tomb, windows shattered, pews overturned, crows perched where candles once burned. No crowds jeered, no loyalists wept, just eyes peering through shutters, blinking through slits in doors, watching a man be erased in real time. They brought him not to a court, but to a square, and not at night, but at noon. No robes, no rites, just wood, iron, and a vat black and bubbling, boiling pitch, thick as sin and hotter than the breath of judgment. The executioners wore no sigils. They didn't have to. This wasn't punishment. This was spectacle. No one spoke his name, not even the herald. Only one sentence was read aloud. By order of the crown, in service of the realm, justice shall be done. No charges, no scripture, not even a prayer. They stripped him of his vestments, one piece at a time. Tunic, stole, alb, until all that remained was a man bare-chested in the sun, ribs sharp beneath skin fasted too long, spine straight as stone. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He looks like a saint." Someone else replied, "He'll burn like one." They tied his hands behind his back, not with rope, but with his own sash, the one he wore every day while blessing the sick, while breaking bread, while baptizing newborns into a faith now silent. A final irony, the church didn't save him, but it bound him. Then they hoisted him over the vat, slowly, deliberately, no drums, no trumpets, just the hiss of pitch and the crackle of judgment. The executioner paused, some say out of mercy, others say to savor the moment. Hugh looked down, not at the tar, but at the cross some child had scratched into the platform with a nail. And then they lowered him. They say he didn't scream. Not at first, not when his feet touched the surface, not when his skin blistered and peeled. Only when the pitch reached his chest did he let out a sound that made even the guards flinch. A sound that didn't beg for mercy, but called something deeper. A wound cut through heaven itself. By the time it was over, there was nothing left but smoke and a silence that weighed more than any crown. And in that silence, something broke. Not just a man, not just a church, but the illusion that faith could ever be apolitical again. They replaced him before the smoke cleared, as if burning a man alive were just a clerical vacancy, as if ash could be swept from stone like it wasn't once a spine. The new bishop arrived with no sermon, no procession, no apology. Just a seal from the crown and eyes that didn't blink when stepping over the scorch marks. He never said Hugh's name, not once. He repainted the altar, refused to bless the crypt, moved into the same chambers without changing the sheets. But no amount of incense could cover the smell, and no decree could silence the murmurs that trailed him like flies. The people did not trust him, but they obeyed, because obedience was cheaper than grief, safer than memory. The peasants returned to the fields, the monks to their chants, the merchants to their coin, but none of them looked him in the eye because they weren't welcoming a shepherd. They were surviving a warden, and power, it noticed. The king's court praised the new bishop's efficiency. Tithes increased, order returned, crime fell. On parchment, the diocese flourished. But behind closed doors, things began to decay in ways no ink could capture. Confessions became shorter, baptisms rarer, masses emptier, because no one feared God more than they now feared his messengers. The bishop began making changes, quiet at first, then absolute. He forbade certain hymns, removed saints' icons that bore too much resemblance to a past best forgotten. He rewrote old sermons, inserting loyalty where faith used to live. And when a young friar once asked about Bishop Hugh, he was sent away to a distant monastery by nightfall. But corruption doesn't announce itself. It spreads in shadows. One winter, grain meant for the poor vanished. The bishop blamed bandits. The next summer, a young girl was found dead behind the cathedral. Her father had questioned a tax. The bishop called it misfortune. By autumn, even the devout prayed with their eyes open. And yet he ruled unchallenged, because fear keeps the wheels turning, because the memory of boiling pitch still clung to the stones, and because no one wanted to be the next name carved out of history. But the people remembered, quietly, in candlelight, in stories told only when the wind was loud. They remembered a bishop who didn't bend, a man who chose truth over survival. And as the new bishop aged, they began to speak that name again, not in defiance but in warning, because power had found its replacement, but the people had not. And the ashes they tried to bury had started to whisper. He came back, but there was nothing left to come back to. Not in body, not in absolution, just in fragments, names spoken through clenched teeth, a flicker behind the eyes of old priests, a story half told before someone glanced over their shoulder. Bishop Hugh returned the way ghosts do, not by knocking but by never really leaving. Years passed, but the cathedral never felt clean again. No matter how many walls were scrubbed, how many relics replaced, how many sermons rewritten. The new bishop aged into bitterness, ruling not like a shepherd but a tax collector in vestments. He had his throne, he had his title, but he never had their faith. That belonged to the dead man still burning beneath their silence. Once during a storm, lightning struck the steeple, split the stone. Locals called it coincidence. The clergy called it divine indifference. But the monks whispered it was him, coming back not for vengeance but to remind them. Silence is not forgetfulness, it's debt. Some say they saw him, not in form but in flicker, at the edge of candlelight, at the top of stairs that creaked with no feet, in dreams that left robes soaked in sweat. A boy swore he heard Latin echoing from the crypt. A woman claimed her dying husband whispered Hugh's name before he passed, even though neither had ever met him. But maybe the cruelest part of a legacy is that it doesn't need proof. Just fear, just memory. The bishop died eventually, alone. His passing marked only by a simple note, natural causes. No crowds, no relics, no sainthood. The church tried to replace him too, but by then the rot had settled in too deep. Parishioners stopped attending. Monks transferred. Pilgrims avoided the region entirely. The cathedral stood, but it no longer preached, it echoed. And so Hugh returned not in fire, but in absence. Every silence that used to protect the church now haunted it. Every lie they told to survive hollowed their walls further. And every sermon ended with a question no one dared ask aloud. What if the martyr wasn't wrong? What if they burned the only man who ever told the truth? And by the time they realized they couldn't erase him, there was no one left to listen. No tomb, no epitaph, no absolution, just silence and the stain it couldn't wash away. In the end, Bishop Hugh was not vindicated. No scroll cleared his name. No king confessed. The church never wept for him. It simply moved on like it always does, dragging its robes through the ashes it swore never existed. There was no justice, just replacement, no reckoning, just forgetting. And yet something still lingered between the stones behind the hymns. Not vengeance, not redemption, just weight. The kind that bends spines over altars and keeps eyes open during prayer. 100 years later, a chronicler found a single footnote in a confiscated letter. One bishop boiled, no trial. That was all. No name, no place. Just the echo of a crime everyone tried to pretend wasn't a crime at all. And in that echo was the final verdict. Hugh didn't die because he lied. He died because he didn't. When kingdoms win, they rewrite. When truth wins, it waits. And Hugh's truth didn't roar. It rotted, patient, poisonous, buried beneath flagstones no one dared lift. The church did not collapse, but it limped. Every bishop after him ruled more carefully. Every vow came with a clause. Every altar was built with less conviction and more caution. His death didn't spark a revolution. It sparked a compromise, quiet, invisible, permanent. And in the end, that was the real punishment, not fire but forgetting. To be erased not because you were evil but because you were inconvenient. To be burned not for what you did, but for what you refused to become. No relics remain. No shrine bears his name. But deep in the cathedral's foundation, there's one stone darker than the rest. Always warm, always quiet, never blessed. They say if you touch it, your hand trembles. not from guilt, but from recognition. Because every generation needs a Hugh, and every generation finds a way to kill him. And now nothing remains, not even a shadow, just smoke long gone and a name the wind still won't carry. Hugh, not saint, not traitor, just a man who chose truth in a century that fed on silence. They tried to burn him from memory. Instead, they made him eternal, because some stories don't end. They echo in stone, in fire, in us. If you're still awake, that means something inside you remembers. Subscribe to The Sleepyera, where history never rests easy. And when the next name is spoken, you'll understand why silence was never an option.